Welcome to Provoking Peace, a podcast by the Sisterhood of Salaam Shalom, where we bring Muslim and Jewish women and our allies into conversation to explore what it really takes to build peace in ourselves, our communities, and our world.
We go beyond the headlines to speak with people who are living this work every day: activists, educators, artists, faith leaders, and more.
We're here to ask bold questions, listen deeply, and invite you to join us in disrupting assumptions and stereotypes, one Muslim and
one Jewish woman at a time. Hi, welcome back to the Provoking Peace podcast. I'm one of the co-hosts, Allison Friedman, and I hope that you were able to watch or listen to the first half of our keynote address from the November 2025 annual conference of the Sisterhood of Salaam Shalom at Rutgers University in New Jersey. We had an amazing panelists with Dalia Fahmy and Peter Beinart, moderated by our own co-host of the podcast and executive director of the Sisterhood, Tahia Vicolo. So hopefully you can stay tuned and listen today to part 2. Enjoy.
There are a lot of questions coming, so I wanted to make sure. So I would like to ask, even though it is a longer discussion, but so what we struggle with in the sisterhood is the use of language. And I just want to go back to it. And it's been, and we are not the only ones, right? It feels that every single conversation we have, it's like walking on eggshells. Like, how is this word going to be interpreted, or that word going to be interpreted? So, and that is sort of in our internal circles. Also, I want to kind of bring up language use in media or in academia, for that matter, too. I just want to give 2 examples of like past week. I'm NPR person, so this is from NPR. But just language use that the person from one of the institutions for peace and policy was talking about current situation. And as he was sort of accounting for chronology of events, he said the savagery of October 7th and the tragedy of what came after. And even though he was quite supportive, but just that use of the language again, because you are again dehumanizing. You're talking about savages and something that is sort of tragedy. So, and within sisterhood, of course, the trigger words or trigger phrases we are faced with is Zionism. How do we define it? How do we use it? Genocide, from the river to the sea. I'm sure there would be many more examples if we went to the audience. But I guess I wanted to see from your own experience and your perspective, what would be something you could share with us that would help us with number one, going through this sort of how do we deal with the terminology, and also where do you see the change happening in the media, right? How this language is used. I guess they're similar but 2 questions.
I mean, I think that first of all, you have to try to use language which puts all people on an equal footing, and so and avoid, as you say, phrases that only get applied to one side, right? So, I mean, I think about the term terrorism, right? Now, I do think there is a definition of terrorism that could be neutral, right? If you're using violence against civilians for a political purpose, right? And I do think by that definition, at least some of the attacks on October 7th, the ones against civilians, were terrorism. But by that definition, denying food for many months to the entire population of Gaza, the vast majority of is also clearly terrorism, certainly, So I think the problem is you either have to use the term to apply it to both Israel and Hamas, right? Or not use it at all and talk about, violence against civilians, a kind of neutral term. And I think similarly, when one uses very, 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 very evocative language, about you have to try to make sure that you're doing it equally. I think in terms of questions, terms like Zionism or river to the sea, I mean, I think the best practice is to ask people what they mean by these terms, and I'm struck by how rarely that actually happens. There was a poll I saw from the University of Chicago which asked both Jewish and Muslim students whether they thought that river to the sea meant that all the Jews had to leave. And 66% of the Jewish students said yes, but only 14% of the Muslim students said yes. So it showed that the term was meaning very, very different things. And so I think that Zionism in particular, I think, is a term that is of tremendous, is an extremely important term to both people who love it and hate it. And I find that they often mean and use it in completely different ways. And so I think that I'm not a fan of basically saying, I don't want to talk to any Jewish Zionists, right? I think it's much more constructive to ask people what they mean, what Zionism means to them. Now, that doesn't mean you can't ask them some tough questions. If they say, for me, Zionism means a Jewish state in which Palestinians have full equality, I think you can legitimately ask some questions about how it's possible that a state that gives Jews legal supremacy can also provide equality to Palestinians. But then I think you're engaged in a kind of a useful conversation in which you're interrogating the meaning that people have, right? If someone says, I support Palestine for the river to the sea, and someone says, but, and then you can ask, well, how do you think, what would be the role for Jews in this decolonized Palestine? How do you envision that? I think those are productive conversations, so that's what I would suggest. The media part? I mean, I think very frequently the media doesn't do that very effectively, which I think is often very connected to the fact that the mainstream media doesn't give much of a platform to Palestinian voices, right? So very frequently the terms that are used get to be defined by American politicians or people who generally don't have much interest in an understanding of the Palestinian experience. And so Palestinians are rarely asked, what does Zionism mean to you? What does river to the sea mean to you? What does intifada mean? Right? There's nothing wrong with asking Jews or even pro-Israel Jews what these terms mean to them as well. But you also have to ask Palestinians, or else you get this asymmetry, right? Where people say, well, we have a problem with river to the sea or intifada because it makes some of the Jewish students feel uncomfortable. Well, it probably does make some of the Jewish students feel uncomfortable. Being uncomfortable is not the same as being unsafe, right? But you should then, if you're going to have that conversation, then you should ask, well, what would it mean for a Palestinian student to hear someone say, I stand with the IDF, or Israel has the right to defend itself, right? That also could make someone extremely uncomfortable. So have those conversations side by side, recognizing that all students have the right to be safe on campus, and all students should be expected to be challenged intellectually on campus.
No, I agree with everything. I also, from the kind of interpersonal, always want to ask us to have an inward reflection of when we say these words sometimes, is it because we want to make the other uncomfortable, make the other upset, right? And so we also have to check ourselves and how we use these terms, right? Words matter, but the intent behind them matters too. And often you see kind of certain, like, I want to like get in your face with my words. Is that productive, right? Does that connote the conversations that we need to have, right? It's the real interpersonal dialogue that's like, please explain to me your understanding, your worldview, so it can inform mine. One of the interesting things that's happened, even in the way media exists today, is that anybody part of debate club, right? Debate club means that when one person's talking, you're preparing your counter argument, which means you're not listening, right? And what's in the gotcha media empire means that we are not actually actively listening to the person we're interviewing, right? And so it's become media's of course evolved. It's a wholly different conference, but when we think about whose voices get centered, whose voices get erased, which version of voices are acceptable, what is allowed to be said, what gets cut from the air, these are all, again, deeper conversations we need to have with ourselves. And so when we talk about words that make us uncomfortable, why is it that they make us uncomfortable? And we have to have these deep conversations, right? This notion of getting uncomfortable, if it doesn't happen in the university, where is it going to happen? if these, Chatham House rule is that what happens in the classroom happens so that students can sloppily ask questions and try to perhaps get to an articulated understanding, so when they leave university, enter into the workforce, they don't make these mistakes there. And today, the very space that's supposed to be protected for students to ask questions in a very kind of, without offending the other, but in a kind of not perhaps having the correct terminology, is the very place, what I talked about earlier, is supposed to be the renewal of democracy, is now the site of the undermining of democracy. And that becomes really interesting. I mean, what's happening in university spaces, what's happening all over the world, but also in terms of the militarization of our streets today, these are all interconnected. And we have to understand that these are interconnected. And then it begs the question of what becomes our role. You know, the great Coretta Scott King, she says, in every generation emerges a group of, I'm sorry, Peter, women. And Peter. And this young man who's been nodding the whole time. And she says, if the soul of our country and our democracy is going to be reclaimed, it becomes your job to reclaim it. She actually charges us with the mission to reclaim the heart of our democracy. And she says it's incumbent upon a group of women to rise up. And that's why when Dr. Aftab invited me, I was like, this could be, inshallah, the group charged, in the words of King, to be the one that reclaims the soul of this country. Because if we're not doing it together, when are we going to do it? And if not now, when?
Amazing. I have more questions, but I got this whole book of questions from the audience. I have a question for two of you. Are you okay with going a little bit longer than what we planned? Because the audience is asking that they don't even have to eat lunch. They just want to hear a little bit more from two of you.
Sure.
So if it just a little bit longer. So here is a question. It says, Dr. Fahmy, you mentioned your positioning of academia as a frontier to develop democracy. How, under Trump 2.0 and growing suppression of the Palestinian rights movement, are you able to navigate this space? And what advice would you give students and faculty to continue their work promoting democracy and human rights given the current threats?
So just to be clear, I don't teach Israel-Palestine. And so, but what I do teach is a lot of theory on democracy, on social responsibility, political theory, and the current political context. And we give our students the tools with to think about history, to apply it to their current political situation. To give students an understanding of how we came to today so they can chart forward their vision of the future. My goal is nothing more than to show students that the world is not black and white, that it's all shades of gray. And it requires a nuanced understanding of the lived experiences of one another, of politics, of history, and that our current moment, imbibed in it, is a history recalled and a future anticipated in a very Hegelian way. And we want the classroom to be the site of gotcha politics. I refuse to let that be the place. I want my students, every single one of them, to feel safe, to feel that it's okay to be sloppy with their terminology, that we're here to learn together, that you're not expected to know everything. I have a big disclaimer at the beginning of every class. I'm like, look, at some point in the semester, you're gonna feel a little uncomfortable with what you're hearing. You're not gonna know why, but you might feel a little uncomfortable. And that's because something you took for granted is being challenged. There's two ways out of it. Either you'll actually now have more evidence for what you believed, or you will have counter evidence that challenged what you believe, but you'll move beyond it. In both instances, you know what's happening? You're learning. Every time you're uncomfortable is because it's an opportunity to learn. we have reached a point in our media's tech-savvy world where we don't want discomfort. If we don't want discomfort, we've actually decapitated the ability to learn.
I just want to comment that some of the things you're bringing up, and it makes me feel very proud, are actually practices of the sisterhood, right? That we trained 40 facilitators on really being aware and deep listening, and we're encouraging people to lean into the discomfort, right? We want to be a little uncomfortable so we can learn. So I'm very happy that some of these practices are already being done by the sisterhood. So Peter, this is for you. Where do you find hope in the polarized Jewish community, and or how do we affect change in the Jewish institutions that are leading voices in the Jewish supremacy you discussed?
I mean, what I take hope from is the number of people who, often at some cost, are challenging things that they were raised to believe, and especially from younger people. I mean, I was at Columbia University at the end of last semester in May, and there were 8 or 10 Jewish students who had chained themselves to the gate to protest the university's complicity in the abduction of Mahmoud Khalil. One of those students who I know who was chained himself to the gate is the son of a settler rabbi in the West Bank. So I see, even at this time where there's so much cowardice from leaders in so many areas of American life, I see often among students, including Jewish students, a lot of courage. And I think that what's coming from that, whether the mainstream Jewish institutions recognize it or not, is not only a quite dramatic shift in terms of the internal politics on Israel and Palestine, but I actually think it's a kind of spiritual renewal that I think is really, really important and really exciting. You know, there's this, what I find is actually, it's striking how much so many of these young American Jews care about Judaism and care about trying to create kind of meaningful, committed Jewish life, which doesn't have the moral corruption of the defense of supremacy. There are in New York, I tried to count just the number of non or anti-Zionist, like minyanim kind of prayer communities that have emerged in New York since 2022. And there are at least 10 or 12, all populated, mostly by people in their 20s and 30s. So this is a very, very fast developing phenomenon. And I'm struck by how much talent there is. And also by the way in which, despite the caricature that we see of what's happening on college campuses, the way in which Jewish and Palestinian and other students have come to know one another and trust one another, around a struggle for a set of common principles. And to me, that gives me hope.
I'm just going to follow up a little bit. First time I heard Peter in person, although every Friday I'm like, okay, let me see what's happening, was at a synagogue in Philadelphia, and it was Ramadan. So I'm fasting and Peter is speaking, and I'm breaking my fast while Peter is speaking, and he's sharing the most beautiful teachings of Judaism with so much heart. I mean, we hear often from Peter this sort of journalist, and which is amazing, but hearing that beautiful combination of analysis and love for teachings of Judaism, and I literally found myself crying. So I just want to share that, and I think that aspect is so important that you bring into this. It reminds us where your values and where our values are in what we do.
Thank you.
So I think this question is for both of you. Please give us, quote unquote, regular people who don't have extensive education in politics, war, conflict resolution, etc. Something tangible and realistic to do in this current time to support and promote Jewish-Palestinian peace and amicable relationships.
So I'm a runner. We got New York City in 2 weeks, and my knees and wearing heels wasn't a good idea. But I remember being in Berlin in 2019, and right outside, just across from the Brandenburg Gate, right outside the US Embassy, is that Holocaust memorial that you have to go. You can't ignore. It is 520 slabs of granite made to look like coffins. And as you enter, it's actually not at 90-degree angles. It's all askew. So as you enter and it goes down, you start to feel lost and confused. And if you're claustrophobic like me, you're drowning. And the beauty of that memorial is it's not just a memorial to the past. It's imbibed with the never again, because you can't ignore the emotional feeling. In Boston, there is the remembrance of the gas chambers. I can't remember what it's called, but it's 6 glass slabs in the middle of a square. And I remember running through it without thinking. I'm like, this is beautiful. And then you stop in the middle, and the ground, the lights are made to look like embers. And there's steam to simulate gas. And then you realize what you're in. And the names are etched with some of the final sentences. And you feel it's glass and it's panels, but you feel like you're drowning. And in Lower Manhattan, if you run down the west side or walk down the west side, New York is noisy, right? And then you come to the bottom, and then all of a sudden there are these beautiful weeping willows, and New York becomes quiet. And right behind the trees is what? The Holocaust Memorial. All 3 of these structures imbibe in them the insistence of an experiential feeling, right? The architects say we wanted people to experience something. Here's my question to everyone. When we build memorials to the children of Gaza, what is the feeling that we want to capture? Then it brings us to a moment of real shame. Why? Because in that ramp in Boston, the granite is actually, the floor is with capital letters, remember, remember, remember. And I always ask myself, if we think about violence like this, through this prism of what is the feeling we want captured, and we can stop it before the feelings exist, then what becomes our responsibility? That it's actually that more compounded. That we should never be thinking about what are the memorials we're going to build and what is the feeling we're going to capture. Is it going to be that this insecurity is coming from the sky, or that these permanently dilated pupils from trauma are... If we start to look at the world through this prism of what is the feeling that we want to capture when we build memorials, I promise you we will stop so flagrantly talking about violence and war. And while I don't have the answer, these communities are the places where we can actually start to hold one another accountable, but more importantly, hold our elected officials accountable, right? Hold all the structures of power accountable, hold big law, hold the universities, hold everyone who's been complicit in the undermining of our democracy, to erase our voices accountable. Because we should never be negotiating what is the feeling we want the memorial to capture. What is the experience? It should bring such a deep level of shame that whether it's Gaza or Sudan or Afghanistan or wherever we are in the world, that we stop it before it begins. And we know when these things are coming down the pike, and that's why I mentioned down the 1990s, is that it was all on our watch. It was all on our watch. This is on our watch. We are witnesses to this history, and that should compel us even more to act as quickly as we can.
I would just add, I think it's really important for us to ask the question, why in Manhattan and in Boston do we have these Holocaust memorials, but we don't have corresponding memorials to the genocide that was committed on this soil, in this continent, that destroyed the Native American people here? And I think the reason it's so important to ask that is not only to honor the memory and try to begin thinking, which we don't even begin in the U.S., a process of reparations and historical justice there, but because I think it is very connected to the way we think about Israel and Palestine. Because, I mean, this is going to sound very dark, but I mean, to go back to the poll you were talking about, right, of Israeli Jews saying they want Palestinians gone. In a way, it's horrifying, but it's not surprising, right? It's weird that people get so upset when you talk about Zionism as settler colonial, right? Zionism wasn't only settler colonial, it was also a refuge for Jews fleeing distress, but it had very clear settler colonial features. These early Zionists themselves refer to themselves as colonists, right? It was not a term of abuse in the early 20th century. But the reason it's important to think about that process and to think about it here, right, is that in a way, what many Israeli Jews want to get to is what we have here, right? Which is, in the 19th century, America had groups that would have looked to Americans a lot like Hamas, right? You had Native Americans were forced off of their lands into smaller and smaller enclaves, and periodically they broke out and sometimes committed terrible massacres of settlers, on the American plains in the 19th century, right? Americans don't worry about that anymore. Right? Not because thank God, not all Native Americans were killed, but the Native American ability to resist politically and militarily was destroyed, right? And in Canada and Australia and Argentina and many other places. So it's not really surprising, right, that many Israeli Jews faced with this problem of Palestinian violence in response to a system of oppression would want to get to where those other places. No one's giving the Canadians a hard time, right? They're actually considered some of the most liberal people in the world, right? And so if we would have a better understanding of that process and where it can lead if we face that here. And we took some responsibility from here. And then when we saw what Donald Trump is talking about basically creating a Riviera and pushing all the Palestinians out, the reason more Americans aren't horrified, I think, is because we're not horrified about the fact that we did it here. And so I think that would be an important part of the process.
I think we can do two more questions. And so here is, I think, Peter, this is for you, but also let me just read it. How do Jews whose fear of losing a safe space to live and worship is visceral and overwhelming also find a path to transform fear and trauma into setting down thoughts of terrorism and anti-Semitism via education, sharing of culture and language? How are we going to get to know one another going forward? Sorry, I just struggled a little bit with the.
I mean, when I meet Jews and notice what their views are on these subjects, there are certain demographic indicators that give me a particular indication. Generation, often to some degree, religiosity, other things, but. The thing that I find is the best the most determinative factor is how much time they've actually spent with Palestinians under circumstances that would allow some human, relatively equal interaction. I think that is that has the most profound influence, right? And I think that because I think that it does reshape people's sense of fear and changes it, right? Because it allows you to start to when you see Palestinians as fully human, and you think about their behavior in a different way, right? It undermines this notion, which is not always stated, but is often understated in mainstream Jewish discourse, that Palestinians behave the way, if Palestinians support violence or commit acts of violence, or if Palestinians hate Israel, it's because they have some kind of cultural pathology, which is just kind of like the reincarnation of the anti-Semitism that always exists throughout human history, right? But when you spend time with people, actually, you almost inevitably realize that that's not what's going on at all, right? That people are responding to the structure of violence that has afflicted them and their parents and their grandparents, and that the way to understand their behavior and their views is in response to that violence and that oppression. And then I think you can start to see, actually, that if you start to confront that violent oppression that makes Palestinians unsafe, you actually create more safety for Jews, for Israeli Jews. That it is not actually safe to inflict tremendous amounts of violence on other people. Again, if you think you can get rid of all of them, then maybe you can get to that place. But God forbid that would be the solution, right? If you're going to have to live alongside people, you're much safer living alongside people who have a voice in government in which they can non-violently get the government to listen to them, right? And Israeli Jews, if you actually talk to them, sometimes you could even get them. I often will ask Israeli Jews or other Jews, why is it that you're terrified to go to Gaza and terrified to go to the West Bank, but you go on the operating table in hospitals in Israel all the time with Palestinian doctors and nurses, and then you get your pills from Palestinian pharmacists, right? They're all Palestinians, right? Why are you so much more afraid of this one group of Palestinians than the other, right? It's not like any of them like Zionism, right? It's because the Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, despite suffering profound oppression, at least have some mechanism for living for bettering their lives and getting the government to listen to them, which doesn't require picking up a gun. When Palestinians in Gaza go march peacefully to the borders of Gaza, they're simply shot en masse, right? There was a Palestinian guy from the West Bank who told me that he was in Atlanta and happened to be in a kind of a very Jewish neighborhood in which he saw a number of Orthodox Jews walking to synagogue. And he said he did a double take because none of them were carrying guns. And he said, it dawned on me that if you're not living in a territory where you're basically denying people basic human rights, right, you actually don't need to carry guns because you're not worried about the response. And I think that's the way in which we can reframe questions of safety. It's not a coincidence that Israel is actually the most dangerous place for Jews to live in the world of any large Jewish community, right? Because supremacy doesn't actually bring safety, right? Because supremacy inflicts violence and then it leads to a system of violence that endangers everybody.
So before you put your mic down, there's a follow-up question to that. So how do members of Jewish community confront and change members of Jewish community, organizations, Jewish community organizations who stand with Israel, right or wrong?
Well, I think that really the answer is going to be to create new institutions. I don't think those institutions, unfortunately, are likely to change. First of all, I want to separate the institutions from the people, right? I think, I don't believe in demonizing people, and I believe that it's important to listen to people who have different views than yours, right? And that includes Jews listening to other Jews and non-Jews. So if people have views about Israel, it's worth asking about the life experience that they have had that have led them to those views. So it's important to be curious and empathetic, even about life experiences, even if they've led to a set of point of views that you really find reprehensible. But the institutions really now are largely controlled by relatively small numbers of very, very large donors. And there's not really a democratic process that's taking place within those institutions. So I think what gives me hope is the creation of a whole set of new institutions that I think will allow people to think about what it means to live a meaningful, committed, and moral Jewish life without this moral corruption that comes in when you try to do that and you put a defense of a system of supremacy inside those institutions. When you don't have that inside the institutions, it opens up all kinds of possibilities, I think, that could be really, really exciting from the perspective of Jewish renewal.
Thank you. So this will be the last question because we are pushing to 12:30, and I really appreciate your patience. I wanted to sort of ask to end this, and my hope is that this whole conference will be learning a lot, sharing a lot, and at the same time strengthening the hope and our own strength to continue working on all of this. So can you share a little bit what gives you hope and inspires you to continue doing this work? And that actually, if we could close with that, that would be great.
The philosopher Peter Singer goes through this thought experiment where he says, if you see a child drowning in a pond and you're dressed, new outfit, new shoes, are you going to jump in and save that child? Of course, we're going to jump in and save that child. But then in his book, which is Famine, Something, and Something, he says the problem is that what we refuse to accept is that the entire world is our pond, that we just believe it's in the immediate, right? But once we accept that the entire world is the pond, and our insistence on not seeing the world or children starving or children being annihilated as part of our obligation, then we're actually doing the injustice of letting a child drown in our presence. And so what gives me hope is that increasingly you see young people seeing the rest of the world as part of their pond. You see young people who are standing up and saying, I don't believe in the economic injustices that my financial success happens at the expense of someone else. I don't believe that my lived existence should happen at the expense of someone else, that my security is tied to insecurity of someone else. That if you listen to young people today, there seems to be an awakening of, with the world is shrinking, it's leading to the interpersonal matters. You know, I end the semester sometimes with, can we redefine the national interest, right? Strategic US foreign policy, for example, to include human interest, even from a realist perspective, right? That security, that national security is actually fundamentally tied to human security. And once we understand that, for example, the closure of USAID led to the unfortunate death of 90,000 children for absolutely no reason when we had those bars of food, but we spent $10 million to burn them, that leads to insecurity in the world, that it's not in our best interest. And I see young people increasingly today insisting that the lived experience of those people over there that I may never see are members of our pond. So if you want to ask me what makes me hopeful, it's young people today.
I thought I kind of already answered a hope-related question. No, I don't want to. I don't want to repeat myself. I guess I would say I think that the movement for Palestinian liberation, it's not perfect. No movement is. Movements bring together all different kinds of people, and I don't necessarily am always going to think that every particular chant is the right chant or the most wise chant at the particular moment. But what I think really does strike me is that when I've gone and had the privilege of speaking to different kinds of crowds, like I went to speak in Little Rock, Arkansas. I was thinking, like, who's involved in this struggle in Little Rock, Arkansas? It was a church that was filled with white people and black people and Jews and Palestinians, both with very thick Southern accents. And you saw there was like really a community of people in Little Rock, Arkansas who were working and who really cared. And I thought, like, these people are this generation's versions of the people who were involved in the anti-apartheid struggle and the struggle against the Vietnam War and the struggle for civil rights and the struggle for women's rights and the struggle against slavery. Like, it's easy to get down on America in this moment, but like there are those people who exist in every generation, as you were saying with Coretta Scott King, and they are really rising and emerging in this moment. And sometimes I get so angry when I hear people sometimes say, well, what do these people know about Israel and Palestine? What skin in the game do they have? And I'm like, it's the people who have no personal connection, just to go to your pond analogy, who inspire me the most. They're the most extraordinary. One of my heroes, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, was a Polish chassid, right? This man had about as limited a cultural relationship with the people of Vietnam as you could possibly imagine. But when he saw the images of children burning from napalm, he was so haunted that he said he could not open the Siddur, the Jewish prayer book, and pray because the images just stared him back when he looked at the page. I see that it's those people and their willingness to rise and be part of this movement that I think is really, really extraordinary. The politicians are the ones who get it last, but even you can start to see the politicians are starting to notice that something has shifted, and that gives me hope.
Thank you. This was incredible, and I feel like we can continue for the rest of the day with the questions, but I very much appreciate you really shared so much with us that we'll continue to discuss in our groups, and thank you for everything both of you are doing and giving us a model of courage and inspiration. Both of you. We appreciate you very much.
Are there any questions you've always wanted to ask a Jew or a Muslim, but didn't know how or where to go? Ask us at podcast@sosspeace.org. We don't speak for everyone in our communities, but we're happy to give you answers from our own perspectives. And to learn more about the Sisterhood, subscribe to the newsletter on our website, sosspeace.org.
If this conversation moved you, challenged you, or made you think, we'd love for you to share it, leave a review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The opinions of speakers and hosts do not always reflect official positions of the Sisterhood. All rights to video and audio content belong to the Sisterhood. Until next time, keep listening,
Keep learning,
and keep provoking peace.